Ezra Wren woke to the smell of sickness before he even opened his eyes. Something was wrong in the west pasture. He grabbed his rifle off the wall and ran barefoot into the cold morning. And what he found stopped him cold. 40 head of cattle, thin as fence posts, coughing blood into the frost, dumped over his fence line in the night like garbage nobody wanted. He did not know it yet, but this single morning would decide the rest of his life. Somebody wanted him ruined, and they had picked the wrong man to ruin. Stick around, because what this rancher did next became a legend that still gets whispered about in cattle towns, from Wyoming to the Texas Panhandle. This is the story of a broke, forgotten rancher named Ezra Wren, and the day his enemies handed him their sickest, dying cattle to destroy him, and how he turned every single one of them into the foundation of the largest herd in the entire territory. Let's go back to 1876, to a dry stretch of land in the Wyoming territory called Split Rock Basin. It was not a place men fought over. The soil was hard, the grass was thin, and most ranchers passed it by for greener country to the north. But Ezra Wren stayed. He had inherited the land from his father, a widowed sharecropper who died owing more than he owned. And Ezra had spent 6 long years trying to turn dust into something worth a name. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and known around town as the man who talked to sick animals like they could talk back. Some folks thought that was foolish. Others thought it was something close to a gift. What Ezra did not know was that 3 miles east, in the town of Larimer Crossing, a cattle baron named Colton Dreyer was holding a meeting in the back room of the Larimer Saloon, and Ezra Wren's name was the only thing on the table. Colton Dreyer ran the Dreyer Cattle Company, the largest operation in 3 counties, and he wanted Split Rock Basin. Not because the grass was good, because underground, a surveyor had found something Colton kept quiet. A spring, a real one, fed by mountain runoff, strong enough to water 10,000 head through a drought that had already killed cattle across half the territory that summer. Colton needed Ezra gone, and he needed it to look like bad luck, not a crime. So he did something cruel and clever at the same time. He rounded up his own sickest cattle, the ones dying slow from a lung sickness spreading through his herd, the kind ranchers called the creeping cough, and instead of burying them like the law required, he had 3 of his hired men drive 40 of them across Ezra's fence line in the dead of night. Here's the part that made this plan almost perfect. Diseased cattle dumped on a small rancher's land back then did one of 2 things. They either infected his healthy stock and wiped him out completely, or the county inspector came through, saw sick animals on his property, and condemned his entire herd on the spot, whether they were sick or not. Either way, Ezra Wren was finished, and nobody could prove Colton Dreyer did a single thing wrong. But here's what Colton did not count on. Ezra Wren had spent his whole life nursing sick things back from the edge, and he was not about to stop now. When he found those 40 dying cattle that morning, his first instinct was not panic, it was memory. His mother had died of a wasting sickness when he was a boy, and his father had spent years afterward learning every folk remedy and frontier medicine trick available to try and save the next person who got sick. Ezra had absorbed all of it without even meaning to. Steam treatments, isolation pens, a tea made from boiled willow bark and wild onion that old-timers swore cleared lung congestion in horses. He built an isolation pen that same day, dragging fence rails until his hands blistered, separating the sick cattle from what little healthy stock he had left. His neighbor, an old widow named Sarah Kestler, rode over when she saw the commotion and asked him the question everybody in town would soon be asking. "Ezra, why in God's name are you saving cattle that aren't even yours?" Ezra did not look up from the fence rail he was hammering into place. His shirt was soaked through with sweat even in the cold. He answered without stopping his work. And Ezra said something that Sarah repeated for years afterward. He said, "Because somebody threw them away like they didn't matter." And I figure that's exactly why I have to prove they do. Sarah sat there on her horse for a long moment, watching him work. She had known Ezra since he was a boy, trailing after his father with a tin bucket of medicine. And she had never once seen him back down from a sick animal, no matter whose it was. She told him plainly that Colton Dreyer was not a man who made mistakes, and that 40 cattle did not wander 3 miles and cross 2 fence lines by accident. Ezra already knew that. He had found boot prints near the gate that morning, 3 sets, walking careful and quiet, the kind of tracks men leave when they do not want to be followed home. He did not say Colton's name out loud that day. He did not need to. Everyone in Split Rock Basin already knew who owned the only herd large enough to spare 40 sick cattle without anyone noticing they were missing. What do you think was really driving him? Pride? Stubbornness? Or something deeper he hadn't said out loud yet? Tell me in the comments, because his answer changes everything by the end of this story. For the first week, it looked hopeless. 12 cattle died, despite everything Ezra tried. He barely slept, moving between the isolation pen and his own small herd, terrified the sickness would jump the fence line no matter how careful he was. The county inspector, a tired, overworked man named Otis Pruitt, rode out on the 5th day, took one look at the isolation pen, and told Ezra flatly that most ranchers in his position simply shot the sick animals and burned the carcasses. It was faster. It was safer. It was what the law expected. Ezra refused. He told Otis he would rather lose everything trying than win nothing by giving up early. And here's the detail almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. Ezra Wren figured out something by pure trial and error that cattle experts would not properly understand for another 50 years. He noticed the cattle that survived the first week all had one thing in common. They were kept warm, dry, and away from wind, more than any medicine he gave them. So he tore boards off his own barn to build windbreaks for the sick pen, sleeping in his half-exposed house through nights that dropped below freezing, because the cattle needed the shelter more than he did. By the 2nd week, the death slowed. By the 3rd week, they stopped completely. 28 cattle survived, not because of some miracle cure, but because one stubborn man refused to let something suffer just because it was inconvenient to save. Ezra remembered the morning the last sick calf finally stood on its own legs and walked to the water trough without stumbling. He said later it was the first time in 3 weeks he let himself cry, standing alone in a frozen pasture at dawn, too tired to feel anything but relief. He had lost 14 pounds off his own frame that month. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold. But 28 animals that should have died in a ditch were alive because he refused to look away from them. But here's the twist nobody in Larimer Crossing saw coming. Word got around town about what Ezra was doing, and instead of admiration, at first, he got suspicion. Colton Dreyer made sure of that. He spread word that Ezra Wren was hiding a diseased herd, that Split Rock Basin was a danger to every rancher downwind, and that the town should consider quarantining Ezra's whole property. For a few tense weeks that spring, Ezra Wren was the most hated man in 3 counties, and he did not even know why. And fixing it wasn't as simple as some men just changing their minds. It took Sarah Kessler standing up at a town meeting in the Larimer Grange Hall to turn the tide. She told the room what she had seen with her own eyes. Cattle at death's door, nursed back to health by a man with no money and no obligation to help, using nothing but grit and homemade remedies. She asked the room a simple question. If Ezra Wren could save cattle that weren't even his, what kind of man did that make him, compared to whoever dumped them there in the first place? Nobody had an answer, because everybody already suspected who it was. One rancher near the back of the hall, a quiet man named Delroy Ames, who had lost half his own herd to bad luck 2 winters running, stood up and said something that shifted the whole room. He said if Ezra Wren could bring dying cattle back from the edge of the grave with nothing but grit and a barn full of scrap lumber, then Split Rock Basin had been sitting on the wrong opinion of him for 6 years. A few men laughed nervously. Most of them nodded. By the time the meeting ended, the talk of quarantine had quietly died, and something else had taken its place, a kind of respect nobody quite knew what to do with yet. By early summer, Ezra had 28 healthy, and now immune, cattle added to his own surviving herd of 15, 43 head total. On land, everyone had written off as worthless. And that's when the real story began, because Colton Dreyer wasn't finished. If you're starting to root for Ezra right now, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel, because what Colton does next is the kind of betrayal that'll make your blood boil, and I don't want you missing it. Colton had expected Ezra to be ruined by summer. Instead, Ezra had a growing herd and a town starting to whisper his name with respect instead of suspicion. So Colton changed tactics. He offered to buy Split Rock Basin outright, at a price so low it insulted the land, wrapped in a friendly smile and a handshake, meant to look neighborly. Ezra said no. Colton tried again in the fall, this time threatening to cut off Ezra's access to the shared cattle trail leading to the railhead in Cheyenne, a trail every small rancher in the basin depended on to sell their stock. Without it, Ezra's cattle were worth nothing. He could raise the healthiest herd in the territory and still starve, because he had no way to sell them. This was the moment that decided everything. Ezra did something nobody expected. Instead of fighting Colton directly, he rode out to every small rancher in Split Rock Basin, one by one, most of them men just as broke and just as ignored by the big cattle companies as he was. He proposed something almost unheard of at the time, a cooperative herd drive, where every small rancher pooled their cattle together, shared the cost of driving them to the railhead, and negotiated as one unified group. Instead of a dozen desperate individuals, Colton could pick off one at a time. 12 ranchers said yes. Delroy Ames was the first to shake his hand. Sarah Kessler signed on before Ezra even finished explaining the plan, saying she trusted him with her cattle more than she trusted Colton Dreyer with a kind word. One by one, small ranchers who had spent years being quietly squeezed out by the Dreyer Cattle Company started showing up at Ezra's gate, bringing tally books and questions and a cautious kind of hope none of them wanted to say out loud, in case it jinxed the whole plan. Have you ever wondered why the biggest changes in history usually come from the people everyone underestimated first? This might be one of those moments. Let me know what you think down in the comments. The joint drive in the spring of 1877 became the largest cattle movement Split Rock Basin had ever seen. 2,300 head total, walking the old trail toward Cheyenne, under a sky that the old cowboys who rode it still describe as endless. Ezra rode point for most of it, the same man who 6 months earlier had been called a danger to the whole county, now trusted to lead the herd of nearly a dozen families toward the only market that could save them. Colton Dreyer tried one final desperate move. He sent riders ahead to the railhead to convince the buyers there that the Split Rock cattle carried disease, the same lie he had used before, hoping to collapse the sale before it even started. But this time, Ezra was ready. He had brought Otis Pruitt, the county inspector, along with the drive, the same man who had once told him to shoot the sick cattle and move on. Otis inspected every single animal publicly, in front of the buyers, in front of the crowd that had gathered, and declared the entire herd, all 2,300 head, completely healthy. Colton's lie collapsed in front of the very people he needed to believe it. The sale that followed was the largest single cattle transaction Split Rock Basin had ever produced. And Ezra Wren, the man who had once owned 15 sickly cattle and a falling down barn, walked away from it as the man who organized it, the man every rancher in the basin now looked to first. Over the next 4 years, Ezra's own herd grew from that original 43 survivors to over 3,000 head, built almost entirely from the offspring of the cattle everyone else had thrown away. He became known not for the size of his herd, though it eventually became the largest in the territory, but for something the old-timers valued even more. He never turned away a sick animal, human problem, or desperate neighbor for the rest of his life. And Colton Dreyer? His company collapsed within 5 years, buried under debt from a drought he had gambled on outlasting, without the water rights to Split Rock Basin he had wanted so badly. He sold his remaining land and left the territory quietly. And nobody in Larimer Crossing ever spoke his name with anything but contempt again. Ezra Wren died in 1922, an old man surrounded by grandchildren, on the same land his father had left him in debt more than 40 years before. At his funeral, ranchers came from counties away to pay respects to a man who had once been called a menace, then a fool, then finally, the man who built an empire out of what everyone else called garbage. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. How many good things in this world got thrown away, simply because somebody decided too fast that they weren't worth saving? Write your answer in the comments, because I read every single one of them, and I want to hear your story too. Before you go, if this story moved you even a little, hit that subscribe button, because we bring you a new one just like it every single week. True frontier stories about the forgotten men and women who built the American West, one impossible decision at a time. This video is an artistic reconstruction created with the help of artificial intelligence, developed independently for entertainment purposes. Please consult official historical sources for accurate information regarding this era and its events.